Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, we talk with Mark Horowitz. He joins us for a discussion about whether online daters are systemically racist and exclusionary. Hello, welcome back to the Dissidents Podcast, and welcome back to Mark Horowitz, who has agreed to visit us hopefully on a recurring basis, so watch for more. Sans Anthony today, so maybe another time we'll have Anthony come. And you had sent me a critique of a review of a book that you had submitted to the Journal of Controversial Ideas, and I'm kind of interested in how it ended up there. But and it's a review of a book called The Dating Divide: Race and Desire in the Era of Online Romance, and it has three authors: Currington, Lundquist, and Lynn. So this is going to be my little summary of, so you feel free, Mark, to correct me. But my little summary of the book is, for what it's worth, is that it's they did an analysis on a large data set, right, of on I don't even know what online platforms they were, but they looked at the analytics. Somehow were given permission to look at the analytics of an online dating site. And then they also did, it says 70 in-depth interviews with diverse daters. And they published this about 350-page book, probably inclusive of references and all of that, about essentially, sort of racial bias in online dating preferences. And you read it and did a book review. So what am I missing just about the book itself that you that you wrote about?
Happy to be here again. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the invitation. And I have a little bit of a cold, so pardon me if I end up coughing a bit. You didn't miss anything. It was well over 1 million. I think I heard one of the authors say millions at one point. So I'm not clear whether it's 1 million, 2 million online interactions from a major online platform that they didn't reveal. So they did indeed get access to see basically who gets messages and who sends messages based on race to discover the disparities that exist in that regard. And then they supplemented it, not with 70, but 77 in-depth interviews with daters. And they provide an overview of those discriminatory patterns and an explanation that I critique pretty heavily in the review.
And I think just from a methodological perspective, I think, people might wonder, like, whoa, how did they get permission? Like, my data might have been part of that, right? Well, there's, the famous Facebook study, right, where they altered the news feed for some people for about 10 minutes, and then looked to see what their next post looked like, and Facebook, users were, when they found out about this, were, horrified or whatever, how dare you. But when we sign up for these kinds of platforms, we do the click-through agreement, right? And we say, hit agree to many things. And one of them oftentimes is that your data might be used, without identification, or with identification, depends on what you're agreeing to and in what kind of a context. But we are often agreeing in these click-through agreements to more than we realize when we sign up for certain apps or in this case, a dating website, Facebook, all of those kinds of things. So it's just, something that people don't give a lot of thought to when they do these things, and it pops up. And I'm guilty too. I've done research on these click-through agreements, and I still go, yeah, whatever. So just, a little methodological background there.
Yeah, and I would add just briefly that with well over 1 million interactions, it's almost certain that it's not about personally identifying information that got obtained, but rather just the patterns of people's messaging that was anonymous.
But there certainly have been examples on campuses, for example, where they have used traffic pattern cameras with traffic pattern to determine where sidewalks should go, where maybe a light should go on a street, and in also on campuses, in classrooms, to essentially document attendance, not an individual person's attendance, but to figure out, how many butts in seats there really are. And there have been, protracted arguments about whether that data, to what extent that data is, potentially identifiable and such. And as a matter of fact, I know I'm going totally off topic here, but I just read a little blurb. It's somebody from Heterodox who has put on her syllabus that her courses may not be recorded because the course is specifically about potentially inflammatory dialogue. So the idea is that, the course is about difficult conversations, and that material could be used, cut, rejiggered, taken out of context, when someone maybe was even assigned to take a position that they don't believe in, could be then labeled as something. And one of the things that came up was those cameras in classrooms, that do exist in some universities, in some classrooms, essentially to document, the how many people are attending courses, not individuals, because they're usually in the back of the room, but you could still capture some kind of data. And they did. I don't know, did they say in the book how these authors, we're just going to refer to them as CLL because that's how you refer to the three authors. How did they reach out to these 77 people? Do you know? Do you recall?
Yeah, it's been so long since I don't remember the exact thing.
Yeah,
But I should,
as a former IRB person, I'm always fascinated. Always interested in these things.
And I should make a disclaimer before we jump in too. I'm glad you said that, Elizabeth. They focus not only on heterosexual daters within particular racial categories, but they also deal with homosexual daters as well as biracial daters. I exclusively focus in my critical review on their, the lion's share of the book, really, the attention that they place on heterosexual daters with one racial identity, across the various racial identities. So just be clear on that.
Yeah, no, that is good to know, because I did wonder, because I did not read the actual book. We could kind of go through a little bit about your arguments. I wrote all over this, this little thing. These are sociologists that wrote the book, and you are a sociologist. And so I recognized your sociological perspective. And then I certainly have some, psychology, sort of cognitive psychology perspectives. So I just want to summarize these brief points, and then we'll jump off from there. So white males are statistically the most desired. So that's one of their findings. One of their findings, white women are not as universally sought as white men. So white men are most desired, white women not quite as much. So Black daters tend to be excluded by most non-Black daters. White women exclude Asian men more than white men exclude Asian women. And then Latino men prefer Latino women. So those are sort of like the basics of their statistical analysis, not necessarily to do. We have some open-ended responses, within some exemplary ones in your article. So so why is that not racism? Why is that not racism, Mark?
Yeah, well, let me back up just to add for the listener to get some clarity when you say most desired, what that means, like in pragmatic terms. So again, they're aggregating potentially millions of times in which people will reach out, send a message, who will receive a message and respond. And from that algorithm, which they're never completely clear on, but they have countless numbers of tables in the text, from that algorithm, they're able to discover these disparities. So basically, white men get on this dating site, they're getting messaged more, they receive messages back more when they send them out. And that's all racial ethnic groups that they're looking at. So they're looking at whites, they're looking at Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, those four major ethnic categories. Then white women are most preferred by white men, but they're not more preferred than women within any given racial category. So really, white men stand out in that regard. Black people in general, they use the phrase romantic apartheid rather strong, and they suggest that they're the most disadvantaged. They reached out the least, perceived as the least attractive as well. They also cover some data on perceptions of attractiveness. These patterns that you just alluded to right now, it wasn't like they hadn't been around. There was this co-founder of OkCupid, Christian Rudder, who wrote a book called Dataclism, I believe back in 2014, which had, talk about getting access. He co-founded the industry, the OkCupid site, and he discovered comparable findings with regard to these discriminatory patterns by race in terms of who people reach out to and who people respond to. What their dating preferences are as revealed by their choices on these platforms. So the question is this racism? Well, my take in the paper is to suggest that it sure can be, not denying that racism exists, that it's part of our culture. What I suggest, though, is that the book is extraordinarily narrowly focused. I read the book when it came out back in 2021. I remember being rather frustrated by it. Basically, what they do is they look at discrimination and call that the same thing as racism. So if there's, and this is a meme we're hearing a lot around a variety of different topics in society. If there's a disparity, it must be racism. And what I suggest is, well, there can be disparities for reasons that are multidimensional, that, yes, could reflect indeed sentiments of racism for the reasons they suggest, but it could also reflect a broader panoply of causes linked to our biological nature, our ethnic nature, social class considerations and how they intersect with resources in our society. I provide a kind of a richer, more complex picture. Also one that turns the temperature down. It was very frustrating. I'd done on the Kindle, I typed the word racism and race. Racism and racist. And those words appeared 200 times in books, only about 300 pages of written text. So two out of 3 pages has the word racist or racism in it. So there's a strong kind of moralizing tone that the authors have about these things, even shaming their 77 interviewees pretty explicitly. And I distill a few of those quotes as well. So I just don't think that is useful in science to take a moralizing posture. And I don't think it's scientifically or empirically valid to focus on solely one level of analysis, apparently closed off to a more multidimensional perspective.
And let me just, again, sort of a methodological thing, we celebrate like, oh, you used big data, you have all these data points and everything. And look, I mean, I'm not looking at the book, and you probably don't remember, but when you have big data like this, larger data sets, everything's significant.
Right.
So a very small effect can become significant just simply because of the largeness of the data set. And I'm sure, you've done this in your courses. I do this in my courses where they, I have them calculate, a Z or a T or, do an ANOVA or whatever with just pretend like your data set is, 10 times as big. What happens? Oh, now I have a significant result. What does that mean? And so while there is a point at which you say, well, the larger data set may actually be leading us astray. It may be leading us to believe that there's a significant result. Statistically there is, but a significant effect in the world that we would, that would be detectable, as we just sort of, navigate our world. So that's one thing I always want to remind people, because we do a lot of research reports in this podcast. It's like, if you don't have to be, you don't have to know your statistics that well, but that's a good thing to remember, is that more data isn't always, the best way to go. So they have, hundreds of thousands of data points. So a very small difference in some of these things then becomes statistically significant. And the other thing for those people who, the first thing a lot of people say is, well, this isn't how I am. This isn't my, this is how I react. Is that, I don't do this. I mean, it's always great to think about research in terms of your own perspective and your own navigation of the world and cognitions. At the same time, there certainly these authors, nor are you, suggesting that all people all the time behave in these kinds of ways. We just like this situation is more nuanced than the authors seem to be suggesting. Our our behavior in the world is much more nuanced than anything, little statistical categorization and stuff. So just again a little research methods lesson there.
Those are useful points and reminders, I think, to the listener. And let me just stress again, all according to their own data, all heterosexual men within each racial group prefer women of their own racial group first. So that's standard sociology of dating. I mean, this is standard endogamy. People prefer within their own group. There's been mountains of evidence for this, goes back long periods of time. The rise of the internet presents us with a useful way to explore which are the relevant causal factors. One of the arguments that has long been made is kind of standard propinquity. Well, you're kind of closer to people of your own ethnicity, and you're going to work with them, and that's who you're going to encounter. Well, the internet provides the opportunity to eliminate those, at least in principle, those geographic and structural barriers. And yet the authors still found, entrenched patterns of racial ethnic preference. Now, I would guess I'd step back and ask the authors if they were here, was that racism for someone who's, Black to prefer a Black partner, or Hispanic to prefer a Hispanic partner? I would suggest that at least it's in part natural. And I know that's controversial to say today, but I think that culture matters to people. It's profoundly part of our nature as a species. So, just to speak to what we're ultimately talking about is when they aggregate millions of interactions, they find that despite the preference of men for women of their own race, women of other races prefer white men the most, even over their own race, which stands out in the data. And they, again, use a very moralizing language. And they talk about how this is, patriarchy, white male supremacy, the internalization of, these sorts of sensibilities among the wider public, language that I think distracts from the empirical argument, which I think is most useful for us to, in a level-headed way, have a conversation about. They find something different than most of the literature that I've seen. I did a pretty big literature review in preparation for my own critical review of the book. They find that Black and white women are not perceived as any less attractive within that group, where most of the literature suggests that Black women have a harder time. The literature overwhelmingly shows this, that Black women, specifically Black women and Asian men, are the least desired groups in these dating platforms. And then white men and Asian women, increasingly Asian women, are seen as more attractive. So what I do is I provide a evolutionarily informed, multidimensional, biosocial explanation for these patterns that acknowledges that, racism matters, but so do other things. And I guess we can, I don't know how much you want me to, I can elaborate forever on it. I don't know if you want more.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, they do. I mean, I'm sure it's worse than what you included here, but just some of the, the sentences and such that you sort of lift from the book and reproduce here. I mean, they offend me. So I can imagine that reading the book in totality was somewhat of a, an annoying, like you said, like, wait, stop. So before we go, I think as sort of a lead into these alternative explanations, I mean, one of the things, so I'm looking at it from a cognitive psychology perspective, and, there's just volumes of data that suggest that, that are very, we're talking biological data, we're talking behavioral data, we're talking about just, sort of, questionnaire data. I mean, it's just all types of physiological, galvanic skin response data over and over and over again. even presenting things below a level of awareness, and I'm not even going to go to the IAT at this point, but the implicit association test, but just presenting things, below a level of awareness, there is a familiarity preference. So, I mean, we're talking like, things I've never seen before, but if I saw them even below my level of awareness in a previous part of, too fast for me to even process whatever that, obscure, usually they use sort of like obscure made up characters, or made up words or something like that. I would still show a preference for that nonsensical figure, word, whatever, later on, simply because I had seen it even a few minutes before, let alone having led a lifetime where similar kinds of people, whether it's people with beards, it's like, oh, I sort of have this preference for men with beards, or my sisters were blonde, I have a preference for whatever. This exposure preference, we could certainly go down, which you don't even touch that kind of stuff in your critique, but this idea that I know nothing else about this person, they don't even seem like a person on a website, right? It's just like a picture and a little description or whatever. The only thing I know about you is what I can see and read, whatever and as you point out, they don't talk anything about the narrative descriptions that the dating, they did not analyze, and maybe someday they will. I have no idea if they have access to that, but that would be a huge, obviously, project. But this idea that the assumption is that it's racism as opposed to just simple, a familiarity effect. I know nothing. So we initially categorize things as, again, below our level of awareness, as good for me, bad for me, dangerous, safe. There's all these kind of, like hot, cold. However, there's lots of different ways of describing this immediate visceral response. Before we can even form cognitions on it, we are categorizing stimuli in our environment all day long. We have to do this. Otherwise, we would be frozen. We could not possibly navigate our world if we didn't, below our level of awareness, register that the light, the light just turned yellow. I may have to, right? If I said, oh, yellow light, what should I do? Oh, red light, I'm dead, right? I'm in the intersection. So I think that, that's part of an evolutionary advantage that we, that all animals, well, even even things that we wouldn't necessarily call animals, have, right? Like roaches fear light. It's like even if the lighted maze path leads to food, the instinct is to avoid the light. And so even if a mate that, would be better for you, that's in a different race category, there's still this hesitancy, right? And so I think it's lovely to be aware of that and to say, oh, I haven't found a match or whatever it is, and maybe I'm instinctively narrowing my search in a way that I shouldn't. That's a lovely awareness to have. It doesn't mean that someone is racist, right? So anyway, so that's my cognitive thing. But you have, you summarize, and so I think that this would be a good way to sort of go into your arguments. I mean, you say they argue 2 points. People's discriminatory dating choices are reproducing race, gender hierarchies in society, and people's romantic desires, which underpin their, discriminating dating choices, are spring from ideologically reinforced race, gender hierarchies. And so you kind of, in most of the rest of the article, you kind of take that on, I would say, from, as you say, a socio-biological kind of perspective. So I want to give, I've been talking too much.
No, not at all. That was very, very helpful, and I agreed with what you said. Those last comments you said, I actually made the point in the paper that they conflate one argument, which is close to being self-evident. If people make discriminatory choices, and we have a society based on, that has characterized by racial ethnic inequality, right? Well, if white European populations continue to engage in endogamy and assortative mating toward their own group, well, then that's going to keep the socioeconomic resources through pair bonding. That's just a sort of common sense observation they make. But then they conflate it with this deeper claim, which I don't believe ever adequately substantiate, which is that our very desires themselves are reducible to our positions within these historical power relationships. So so their basic idea is pretty straightforward. So the reason blacks are less desired in the dating market is because they've been at the bottom of the stratification system since the founding of the country, right? So they'll assume that power dynamic reinforced ideologically through dominant images. They continually use phrases like controlling image, dominant stereotyping, which they axiomatically dismiss the possibility that any stereotype could ever have any empirical reference to it or relevant empirical reference to it. And so I find that bizarre that they wouldn't critically interrogate and ask themselves the question, could there be, and again, this is super sensitive, but could there be any truth to any particular stereotyping? At one point they say, white men are rejected because, Asian men are rejected because of stereotypes of passivity, or femininity or something of that sort. Everything's always a stereotype. So just to give you an inkling behind why I called the piece The Dating Dupe. Another book's called The Dating Divide. I call my piece The Dating Dupe. And the limits of biosocially unfriendly sociology is everybody in a sense is just kind of taking in all of these media images. And therefore my desire, or there's 77 interviewees who say, some of them say, well, I'm just not into black people, or maybe some of the women would say, oh, I'm just not into Asian men. And they're going to say, well, that's your personal choice from your point of view, but in reality, it reflects this undergirding internalization of images in society and from a deep historical perspective. And I come in and suggest, sure, that plays a role. We're deeply influenced by wider social images in our society. The relationships of power still matter today, but they simply not the whole story. And there's these weird inconsistencies that end up coming out in their data that they cannot explain. How, for example, they provide attractiveness data for every group, and then they leave out Asian women. So I ended up writing the third author, who apparently did most of the methodological heavy lifting in the book. And he ended up sending me the table they didn't include, which showed that Asian women are actually perceived as more attractive by all groups. So if stereotyping is what's going on, and we live in a white supremacist society, why would Asian women be seen as most attractive? If things are reducible to relationships of power and resources, why would Asian men, who have on average, the authors themselves acknowledge this in the book, Asian men now have on average more resources than white men? Why wouldn't they be sort of topping the list of preferred partners for women to date, right? So to me, it just screams that more is going on than just power and stereotyping. There's also biology. There's also culture. These things matter a great deal in terms of who people choose to date, and to enter in with a one-dimensional kind of racism explains all disparity card, coupled with a kind of moralizing tone, I don't think does justice to the phenomenon empirically, and I think it contributes to all of the social and political polarization that we see in society today. It leads people like me to get nervous talking about things that we talk about over the dinner table all the time with our friends and family, and yet we can't write about it academically without fearing for our careers.
Right. And, so as you were talking, I was thinking, and you don't say this, so in the article, it feels very much like they're accusing, daters of sort of using, I don't know, a club where a hammer would do, sort of like, where you're they're actually accusing daters of rejecting wide swaths of potential, partners because of, they're being a little sort of being the thought police. Like, we know what you're thinking. Mm-hmm. We know what you're thinking better than you know what you're thinking. We are uniquely qualified as sociologists to diagnose this social ill kind of theme. while at the same time using that exact club to beat. It's like, but wait, that's the same tool you're using. You're using those same, narrowly defined stereotypes to form your own argument. So, um, oftentimes on this podcast, we ask each other, are we guilty of the same thing? Are we, are we using, are we essentially somewhat being hypocritical, in our criticism of whatever, or in our beliefs or whatever, in our methodology. And I think that, I think sometimes that happens and they don't own it, like I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they do say in the beginning of the book, like, we're using this really narrow thing to interpret throughout this book, and forgive us. I mean, that happens. Sometimes that's important to do, right? Like, from this perspective, we're only going to use this perspective to look at this problem. What if we did that? And then you invite, maybe, like, sometimes this happens in journals, right, where they have a whole issue. Somebody else takes an entirely different perspective and they can explain the same phenomenon from a different way. And these authors, as you point out, just didn't do that. They are not perhaps being as self-reflective as we would hope a researcher would be, considering the possibility that they might be wrong.
No, I think that's a great point. I mentioned in the piece that they have one passing reference to evolutionary psychology, to David Buss and evolutionary psychological approaches to mating. I mean, it's such an extraordinary contribution to understanding mating behavior, and then to have a passing footnote on it. And let me back up a minute and give my own sort of interpretation, playing a little bit of a devil's advocate on their side. I think, and this is characteristic of left liberal intellectuals in general. In our last podcast, Elizabeth, Anthony Hayner and I talked about the tendency of left intellectuals to kind of sacralize vulnerable people. So I think what's going on, at least in part, is there's a deep compassion toward Black people, Black women, Asian men, other people that face these disparities in the dating market. And if there's any conversation that could suggest there may be a biology, even in part, to any of these things, it's perceived as, therefore it's inevitable, it cannot be changed, and it's something that runs deeply counter their deepest moral, emotional commitments. So they're inclined, therefore, to ignore literature that deals with biology because it runs against their desire, as they call it. They want to abolish the dating divide. They want everyone to be dating everyone. They appear to believe that there's no biocultural underpinning, or the psychological perspective you offered a little while ago. They appear to think all of those things are purely socially constructed. And therefore, if we just become aware through their help, we'll come to understand that we've internalized all of these biases, and we can deconstruct all these preferences and then date everyone. Everyone's a potential dating partner across all different kinds of racial lines. So I think they're compassion driven, but their compassion leads them to a kind of narrowness, at least inadvertently, and it leads them to make claims. I distilled one line that arguably the most absurd, where they say, I might not get it perfectly right, but they say something in effect, it's not that there are bodies that are objectively more attractive than any other body, but these bodies reflect the racial hierarchy. So and that, just from an evolutionary point of view, is wildly naive. I mean, there's overwhelming evidence that women prefer tall, broad-shouldered men. There's a universal preference for this, that men tend to be attracted to women that are closer to reproductive age. Wide literature suggesting that the perceptions of attraction toward particularly East Asian women could be due to neoteny. I'm sorry, I mentioned my cold.
Yeah.
Let me take a sip here. Yeah, so neoteny refers to the preservation of these youthful characteristics later in life. That could clearly be playing a role in why Asian women are perceived to be as more attractive. Asian men being shorter in stature. This could be part of a multidimensional explanation for why they struggle a bit more. And I would argue, for what it's worth, that you're not being actually, in the end of the day, compassionate if you're not being truthful.
Yeah.
So I think these things matter. They should be part of the conversation, and I don't think we should be demonized, for bringing these up. which is certainly something, if you read The Dating Divide, you'll get the sense that if you try to bring up these things, you indeed would face a significant degree of hostility from the authors, I would suspect.
Well, and I think, I mean, you bring up age, and I know that you said that they did analyze, same-sex um, people who were searching for a same-sex partner. But I think that an extension of their article, or of their argument here, is that preference for the opposite sex is, essentially deeply, held homophobic beliefs. Like, again, I'm extending. They didn't make that argument, but I'm sort of extending. And that refusal to date, a 50, 60-year-old woman, if you're a 30-year-old man, is ageist. And that, so extending these sort of like, these deeply held beliefs that you have about who's the appropriate partner for you. I mean, where do we stop? And this moralistic kind of thing, there's something wrong with us. You're contaminate, your thought process is somehow contaminated, and you're you're excluding these wonderful possibilities. And certainly there are young men who marry older women, and certainly same-sex partnerships are, but and here's and we could go the opposite too, right? Like, would I, as an older woman, be being engaging in ageism by not saying, I'll date someone who's much younger? Or what? Geez, why are you looking for someone of the same sex? How dare you look for someone of the same sex when there's all these opportunities for you? And so I doubt very seriously that they would ever address that. But am I getting it wrong? Does it feel like that?
I toward the very end, I start raising these broader kinds of claims that could be made if you once you exempt from your theoretical framework any attention to the possibility of biology playing a significant role, or you imply, if not directly state, that even those preferences are socially constructed. I drew a whole bunch of different quotes from the book to that effect. Well, then you're opening the door for these sorts of absurdities. The only reason why men would prefer a woman closer to reproductive age is because through socialization they've always been taught that. And if we just socialize them differently, then they'll find themselves attracted. I mean, and I don't want to mock them, but it would be outlandish to do this. And then what frustrates me the most, though, like I don't even mind someone having a narrow empirical perspective, but to be so trigger ready to jump on anyone, like I'm being racist to say that Asian women are neotenous and therefore perceived that plays a role in their greater perception of attractiveness. It's like I'm being racist against Black women or something like that. Nothing could be further from the truth. I just simply want to understand the roots of these patterns in a multidimensional way. One of the most controversial moments in the piece is when I just speculate about the role of class. So talk about culture, talk about biology, but also talk about social class. When you have, and this is, I don't have the answer to this question. I mean, raise it for discussion with you, Elizabeth. Is it racist for someone to do a kind of statistical discrimination and say to themselves, well, this racial ethnic category is likely to be less financially well off. So all things being equal, I'll choose white men because they're going to have more resources on average, say, than a Black man. Is that racist? Again, super delicate.
Right.
I wouldn't recommend that mode of thinking, but the blanket call that all of these sorts of thinking can be just reduced to feelings of racism rooted in the history of racial oppression, it just doesn't explain the nuances fairly enough for what's really going on in people's dating lives.
And if you think about the way that we evaluate people's decision making in the rest of in all aspects of their lives, we actually condone and actually praise people for making decisions like you just described. So if we talk about like, all things being equal, should I choose the job where I'm going to make more money? Yes, I should. All things being equal, should I choose the job where the weather is, I perceive, like I'm a snow skier. Should I choose the job in ski country? Yes, you should. So as you just pointed out, like all things being equal, the kind of thing, it's like, look, we face these decisions in our lives all day, every day. And we actually teach our children how to make decisions. It's like when you want more than one thing. I want both desserts. Well, you gotta choose. I mean, these are like basic decision making rules that we praise people for, and that researchers have been studying, for a long time. Advertisers study these, decision making, you know, uh, algorithms that that humans use, and not only when we use them well, but we also are extremely critical of people when they seem to be make their decision from their heart instead of their head. And so these same things that impact our daily lives in so many other decisions are somehow now taboo when it comes to dating. And I would say, and I actually think that they bring this up, or you say that they bring this up, this idea like, oh, families suggest, like, oh, geez, I really don't think you should, I don't know, date someone that different in age, or that different in race, or that different in socioeconomic status, or whatever. Guess what? Our families have been telling us how to make decisions. Like, the idea that we can just erase it from one aspect of our life. I mean, they've been telling us what to wear. Don't wear. Little kids, they want to wear their like Spider-Man outfit or whatever to a wedding. It's like we've been socially, sort of brought up to learn what it means to make good decisions, and the idea that we wouldn't apply those same kinds of heart and head kinds of things to dating is just nonsensical. It's just completely nonsensical. And so yeah, you do mention that they say something a little bit about that, but not in that sort of like open-minded kind of way, but that families are perpetuating the problem.
Right. And again, it raises the foundational question that I don't ultimately answer. Should we be politicizing our dating choices in the first place? Should we be, quote unquote, calling out if we have racial preferences? I think if they were here, they would say, well, we just want people to be aware, like you said earlier, Elizabeth, be aware of potential biases. And I agree with that. I think we all agree with that. But to bend the stick so far as to then say any discriminatory pattern must only be explainable based on these internalized racist sentiments, typically because one group wants to monopolize power over another group. Power always seems to be the master key used by critical sociologists to explain phenomena. It's a very important concept, but it's not everything. So I don't know if these things should be moralized or politicized. I think they should be explained. And I think I'm encouraging, this was my first foray into this literature. It wasn't like I was trained in the sociology of dating and never taught marriage and family, that sort of thing. But I'm encouraging more and more researchers to be thinking about how, these evolutionary psychological, these cultural phenomena interact with racist sentiments and the historical approach that they use in the book to understand dating choices multidimensionally in an integrated biosocial way.
So, and I did want now I do want to mention the implicit associations task, just simply because I think so many people are familiar with this. And I mean, we go from like Hillary Clinton, actually talked about implicit bias in one of her campaign speeches and stuff. And I think even the researchers who made the implicit associations task, the IAT. And you can go, by the way, to Project Implicit, the website, and you can take some for your own, yourself. I don't know, a few years ago, I took one about, bias against smokers, for example. So, it's like you do, and so what you're doing is as fast as you can, linking some stimuli that appears in the, on your screen with either something that is with a category, one category or the other. And you're supposed to, like, as fast as you can. And they flip things, for left and right hand bias and those kinds of things. And, there's certainly plenty of evidence that people show what the researchers, I think perhaps maybe they regret this, called allowed to be called bias. So originally it was called it is called the implicit associations task, not the implicit bias task, the implicit associations. So what this represents, and we've already alluded to this, is it's basically a test of how well you've learned to categorize your world. Not a bad thing. Not a bad thing as we navigate our world to group things that are, familiar and or unfamiliar into categories that allow us to, save our cognitive resources for other things. This implicit associations task really has never been systematically linked to behavior. So there've been a study here or there where they find, some, statistically significant link but nothing nothing replicable, nothing, that we can really link sort of this computerized task to to subsequent behavior. And at first I was reading this and I was like, oh, this is kind of, people aren't, if you think about maybe like a dating site is like swipe left, swipe right, or yes, no, like as fast as you can, because you're like got to get through all this stuff or whatever. I'm like,
Yeah.
maybe this is one of the sort of behavioral, maybe this is an example of implicit associations, resulting in behavioral, um, uh, outcomes. And then I'm like, actually, once again, we don't really have any we don't have any real outcome data here, right? All we have is another example of this quick swipe left, swipe right, implicit sort of like learning of categories. What have we demonstrated? We've demonstrated that people have learned categories and can apply them in a setting that's new, with stimuli that are new, and that kind of thing. So I'm like, actually, we still don't have behavioral data. We don't know if people would make the same choices in I don't know, not a speed dating thing, but in a workplace that was, multicultural, with different, all different ages, levels of fitness, because they talk about you mentioned fitness, attractiveness, all that kind of thing. Would people make these same kinds of would people who did it in dating replicate their behavior, in a setting? We don't know that. And so at first, like I said, I was like, "Ooh, this is, maybe an example." And then I wrote, "Oh, actually, our dating sites, learned categorization or the ultimate IAT." It's like, oh wait. So I don't know what you think. I'm kind of asking you on the spot here what you think about that. Like, is this an example of behavior that demonstrates the, potentially, IAT, outcomes, or what? What do you think?
I'll answer that by a woman that I quoted. I ended up looking at so many profiles as I'm preparing the critical review, and I found this just lovely written profile by this biracial dater, and I ended up getting permission from her to cut and paste it into the paper, where she, as a black-white biracial dater, she tried to date black men. She comes from a conservative area, and she struggled with it. And she wrote in there, just, I don't want to waste anyone's time. I know we're not going to be culturally compatible, right? So I use that as an example for what could be going on in terms of implicit association, going back to, say, Asian men. So many women. I never encountered a single man on any of the data sites I ever looked at that had a height preference. Very common for women. Women will rather brutally, no one under 5'10", no one under 6 feet, and Asian men are, several inches shorter. And so let's just give this as a concrete example, Elizabeth. Women doing you're looking through 1,000, you're trying to swipe, and you're Asian men out. And it's not fair. One of those Asian men's going to be 5'12", 5'11", or whatever, 6 feet tall. And yet the brain, you have limited time in life, right? Are we going to be making these sorts of assumptions? I guess preparing the individual, if you decide to deliberate over this and treat every single person in the way which it's a wonderful, we can say, okay, we'll spend the time to, in every case, give everybody a chance. Well, then you're going to be spending scarce resources reaching out to someone, and then they end up being shorter than your dating preference, because that's what most likely is going to happen, and you've lost a lot of time, right? So again, that earlier question that I raised with you, it's like, is it racism to engage in some kind of statistical discrimination that our brain is automatically picking up that ends up getting measured in these implicit association tests? I'm inclined to think it's not. I'm inclined to think it's natural, although I would share with the authors a desire to be sensitive and aware, and to the extent possible, open to, dating across racial lines and everything else. But again, the moralizing tone, the posture, the one-dimensional empirical, I have to reject that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, we've all been in a situation where, it's like, I don't know, we're told to get, mustard at the, it's like maybe I don't like mustard, and it's like I'm told to get mustard for the picnic or whatever. And if you've ever been to the mustard aisle, there's a lot of choices. Okay. There's brown mustard, and there's this mustard, and there's that mustard, there's honey mustard, and there's, so if we weren't capable of doing the grocery equivalent of swipe left, swipe right, whatever, then we would be, not only wasting our own time, we'd be wasting a lot of other people's times. And can you imagine like standing there and reading the ingredient list of every, product that we were comparing? And that's sort of what you're describing here is like, I mean, these could be thousands of possibilities, certainly in any one day, tens, or possibly 100, I guess, I don't know, at in any one, like, even if you were attending to it, like daily, it's going to be tens of options. Is this something that you really want to take on as your job? Read every single profile and self, sort of do some navel gazing about why you would consider a person or not. Or it's like, look, I have limited time to date, limited time to peruse dating sites. I've already put in a lot of time in maybe creating my profile or whatever. How much more effort do you put in? And I think that as people, I mean, I'm sure you've heard it too, people just getting so disgusted with this process of, online dating, where it's like, oh, I try and I try. And so you perhaps people get more, are more likely to use these, these criteria, these categorizations over time, not less, because it's like, oh my God, another, bad experience. Also, have you seen, do you remember the research on like the color that someone was wearing in their profile? Do you remember this?
No.
So there was a research study that women who wore red in their profile were more likely to get clicks. So now we're also colorists. So, so I wrote that little note on here, t-shirt color research. So, because there, as you point out, there's a lot of nuance here. There's a lot of things that are going into it, and it could even be the background. We were just talking about our backgrounds, for this podcast. What's in someone's background? This is part of the implicit associations that we make, right? Like, what is this person interested in? And you can pick up, even below your level of awareness, what's going on. None of the narrative stuff was analyzed. So yeah, I think if we strip humanity down to just the visual little, picture, I mean, I guess, what are we left with but to categorize based on what we see? I'm not sure that we should be called racist for that.
And let me add to this methodologically as well, because I didn't hit on it enough. It's not just the biological components where a woman might swipe. I always forget, left, or you reject.
I know. Yeah.
Whichever one rejects.
Yeah.
If they see an Asian man, or not a non-Asian woman, I should say, swiping that. But there's also cultural realities. The authors, their basic method will be to show something like, well, women overwhelmingly want an educated suitor, right? So, and that's something they were able to get in their aggregate data, indicate their level of education on there, and they were able to get that. Again, it's anonymous, but they were able to look at those relationships in their algorithm, and they'll say, oh, look, women will prefer a white woman will prefer a less educated white man over a more educated black man. Racism, big spotlight, racism, or Asian man, less educated white man over a more educated Asian man. And I write in the paper, it's like, well, you're not looking at profiles. There's so much cultural compatibility communicated through the language someone uses. I mean, word choices are exquisitely important in dating. And when you start to feel a sense of connection with someone, even the word connection, it means you're relating to their life experience. All of these deep biocultural realities and lived experience realities come out through the language and communication we use. The authors, again, just miss that. Any disparity based on that shows that racism must be the cause of it. And it's obviously more complicated than that. Doesn't mean we don't have an open discussion. Doesn't mean we don't take seriously our racial biases. It does mean that we're honest, though. And this is something I hint at toward the very end of the review. It's like, I honestly don't even think they're being honest. I don't mean to be personally critical, but to ignore the possibility that our evolved biocultural natures play a role in this is just, it just does too big an injustice to the phenomenon.
Yeah, and I would be forgiving of them if they said, look, we're going to take this really narrow perspective. We're going to take the, and we're going to leave it to someone else to because, and whatever. That's, I mean, they could certainly be forgiven for not including every possible scenario in their book. That's not what people do when they write a book. They don't try to take every possible, Now, I think we are, like in a research article, we would have expected people to include much more. And I also, I think you're right. Like, without that sort of caveat, without that saying like, look, we realize that we're going to go down one narrow path here. It's frustrating. And I do think that if their book was instead a research article, we could even be more critical of that perspective. But I would have liked to have seen from researchers now that I think about, how like now a lot of the journals ask people for their like, their, I don't know, what do you even call it? You submit a statement about your own
your ethnic identity or
something like that. So there like I would have liked to have seen in this weird kind of way, an awareness of their own, bias. I mean, you do say this, their book, unfortunately, combines a couple of defects, you say, in contemporary sociology, a possibly willful incuriosity, possibly willful incuriosity about explanations not, at the level of the, social coupled with their moralistic kind of stance. So they're sort of willful incuriosity about alternative explanations. And again, maybe I'm a little more forgiving because I didn't actually read the book, and it is a book, not a research article. But it does feel. I mean, you are generous in the end, and at the same time, critical. And I guess I'm trying to do the same thing. I'm trying to be somewhat generous in that, when you're writing a book, you're kind of allowed to be that way. But you do say, that you suspect that their progressive cosmopolitan sensibilities blind them. So here it's like, look, you blind them to the possibility that people can care about race without necessarily being racist. And I thought that was a really, sort of like, now we're calling on you to, look at your own, your own algorithms, in analyzing this data. Anyway, I thought, I did want to ask you too, how did this, so did you submit this anywhere else other than?
Actually, I intended it for, for controversial ideas. I knew how controversial it was. I was afraid to send it in. It was a interesting process with the reviewers. I had kind of mixed reviews, kind of navigating it. One thing that surprised me is that, it's gotten like a lot of attention. Like on ResearchGate, it gets read dozens of times every month. So yeah, it's got quite a bit of attention. It's pretty much almost sadly the only thing people are reading of what I have on ResearchGate.
Yeah.
So obviously it's striking a nerve. It's hitting on something very important. Maybe it's because I am so deeply committed to having a compassionate tone in it, which I'm not just doing for political reasons, like to cover myself. It's how I really feel. It's like telling people that they have on average characteristics that people in the dating market are filtering out for reasons that might have a biological component. That sucks. I mean, no one wants to be told. I teach in my senior seminar class, since I focus on controversy. I have a section on evolutionary psychology, and I'm extremely sensitive about that. I mean, you're a short guy in the class. You want to hear that there's an instinctual preference for tall men. You don't want to hear that. If there are other features that someone has, that may not fall within the, evolved psychological predispositions of in the dating world. So I think it is imperative on all of us as educators to be sensitive about the ideas that we communicate, but not so sensitive as to be willfully incurious, willfully blind, and, or to make matters worse, condemnatory of those who want to integrate in a multidimensional way, to go, yes, acknowledge the role. I do think racist sentiments no doubt play a role in some number of people's dating choices, right? For reasons that are linked to the history
and whether they're aware of it or not. I mean, certainly some people may be explicitly racist, some people,
right.
less so. Not that it's not there, but simply that there's more to everyone's story. I think most. I mean, again, and this probably happens to you too, but mostly I think more so in psychology, people are really resentful when you say something like, women aren't interested in science, or, it's like the first reaction, I mentioned this early on, when we were talking today, it's like the first reaction is, well, that's not me. It's like, whoa, right? Like, don't tell me, don't be the thought police. Don't tell me what I think. And so there are other ways to help people think about their, again, I think most people, it's like, oh, maybe I am being, I'm not getting anywhere here. Maybe instead of being more narrow, I should be more broad. And here's, some evidence that suggests that we should. So there's other ways to communicate. And this is a different aspect of your language argument, like that they missed all of the, descriptors and stuff. And somebody who studies language, I mean, small things are so important. The way that you communicate an idea, just little words, weaponizing words versus using words, in this more, again, more inclusive way. And they certainly, I mean, if they're talking about racism or some version of that on almost 2/3 of the pages, that is not an inclusive, that's not a, we invite you to the party
Yes,
kind of
right.
way of talking about this.
Absolutely. You're making me think of just a wider debate about gender disparities in the work world. And, obviously for someone to say, well, women aren't interested in engineering, that would be a gross overgeneralization. But even saying on average can get you in trouble.
Yeah.
Like on average, there's these preferences. That is also something. And I think because people are so politically, and we've talked a lot about this, Elizabeth, and heterodox thinkers in general talk a lot about this, we're so committed to egalitarian equality that we don't even want to see these average differences, much less attribute them to any kind of bioemotive difference between men and women. That is seen, obviously Steven Pinker writes about this, ends up being seen as biologically inevitable. But again, just to stress the point I made earlier, we're not advancing social justice on faulty empirical assumptions. And if these regularities exist, we have to be honest about them.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to stop, unless you.
No, that was great. I apologize about my throat the whole time.
Yeah. So I want to give, we want to give Mark's throat a break here, and we'll end it there. But hopefully we'll have you back.
I look forward to it. Thanks.